The night she stepped out of that black SUV, nobody on that street knew they were about to witness the beginning of a war disguised as a wedding. Rain hammered the pavement, neon signs bled across the puddles, and in the middle of that cold, filthy sidewalk, a homeless man was kneeling with blood on his lip and bruises on his hands. Ignored by everyone except the most feared woman in the city. She walked straight toward him in a black dress that looked too expensive for that part of town, crouched in front of him like she had all the time in the world, lifted his chin with one gloved finger, and said the words that would destroy lives, ignite an empire, and leave bodies in places no one expected. Marry me, and I'll make the man who betrayed me beg for mercy. And the strangest part was this: the homeless man smiled like he had been waiting for her. Engage in our comments section and tell us where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. Whether you're in Georgia, Moscow, Ohio, California, New York, Mexico City, Tokyo, drop your location below. And if you're new to this channel, hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss any of our videos. Because tonight's story is the kind of story people don't believe until the ending forces them to. A woman with power most men would kill for. A husband who thought betrayal would make him richer. A stranger from the gutter who should have been forgettable, invisible, disposable. And yet by the time this story is over, one man will lose everything he ever thought he controlled. One criminal empire will be set on fire from the inside, and the man pulled from the street like a broken nobody may turn out to be the most dangerous person in the entire city. So, the real question isn't why the Mafia queen married a beggar. The real question is why the beggar got into the car so fast. Like he already knew this night would change everything. To understand why that moment mattered, you have to understand who she was before the rain, before the revenge, before the ring, before the city started whispering her new husband's name like a warning. Her name was Serafina Vale. In public, she was the kind of woman magazines called elegant, strategic, impossible to read. To politicians, she was a donor. To business leaders, she was a negotiator. To the police, she was a rumor they could never quite pin down. But to the men who actually lived in the underworld of that city, Serafina was something much simpler and far more terrifying. She was the queen. Not because someone handed her a throne, and not because she inherited one. She took it, piece by piece, blood by blood, deal by deal, betrayal by betrayal. While other families built their names through brute force and fear, Serafina built hers through patience. She understood something most dangerous people never learn. Real power doesn't shout. It waits. And when it finally moves, it's already too late. By the time she was in her early 30s, Serafina controlled shipping routes, private clubs, shell companies, real estate, underground finance channels, luxury import fronts, and enough dirt on enough powerful men to end careers before breakfast. People called her ruthless, but that was the lazy version of the truth. Ruthless implies emotion. Serafina was disciplined. She didn't waste bullets on people who could be ruined more effectively by debt, humiliation, silence, or timing. She didn't need to scream to be obeyed. She didn't need to threaten to be feared. And because of that, every room changed when she entered it. Men twice her age stood straighter. Rivals smiled too hard. Partners chose their words carefully. She was the kind of woman who could order a death with the same calm expression she used to order champagne. But there was one thing no one saw coming. For all the power she had, for all the control she demanded, for all the distance she kept between herself and everyone else, Serafina still wanted something dangerously ordinary. She wanted love. And that is where the first mistake was made. Not by her enemies, not by the men watching her empire from across the river, not by the rival crews waiting for weakness. The first mistake was made the moment Serafina let herself believe she could have a normal husband. His name was Grant Mercer. If Serafina was made of sharpened steel, Grant looked like the exact opposite. Clean-cut, polished, charming, the kind of man who wore tailored suits and easy smiles. He wasn't born into the life. He wasn't raised around guns or loyalty oaths or whispered threats in private dining rooms. He came from a world of business lunches, startup investments, gallery openings, and charity boards. When Serafina first met him, the people around her were suspicious, for reasons they didn't even bother hiding. He was too polished, too eager, too comfortable around danger for someone who claimed to hate it. But Grant knew how to play a role. He made Serafina laugh. He made her feel seen. He made her feel, for the first time in years, like she could set the crown down for a moment and simply be a woman. That was the trap. And the cruel part is that the trap didn't look like a trap. It looked like breakfast on Sunday mornings. It looked like a hand on the small of her back. It looked like soft conversations in the dark. It looked like the promise of a future that didn't involve blood on marble floors. Grant told her he didn't want her empire. He told her he didn't care about her power. He told her he loved the version of her that the world never got to touch. And for a while, Serafina believed him, against the warnings of her inner circle, against the instincts that had kept her alive longer than most of the men around her, against the quiet discomfort of people who had bled for her and knew exactly what men like Grant usually wanted. She married him quietly, privately, far from cameras, far from public spectacle, far from the eyes of the families who would have turned it into a political statement. It was supposed to be the one thing in her life that belonged only to her, not business, not strategy, not violence, just love. But men like Grant don't fall in love with power. They fall in love with proximity to power. They like standing close enough to feel important, close enough to touch what others can't, close enough to imagine the throne belongs to them too. And for months, maybe longer, Grant played his role perfectly. He listened when Serafina spoke. He learned the names of her trusted people. He learned which meetings mattered. He learned which accounts moved the most money. He learned which warehouses were fronts and which were real. He learned how her security rotated. He learned who could be bought, who could be blackmailed, and who could be seduced. He learned everything. Because while Serafina was teaching herself how to trust him, Grant was teaching himself how to rob a queen without pulling a single trigger. And the worst part is that the signs were there. Small things at first. Late nights. Excuses that arrived too quickly. A phone that suddenly never left his pocket. Messages deleted too carefully. A cologne that wasn't his. A smile that came half a second too late. Serafina noticed. Of course she noticed. Women like her don't miss details. They just choose, sometimes, not to believe what those details are trying to say. The night everything changed wasn't supposed to be personal. It was supposed to be routine. A charity gala, expensive gowns, crystal glasses, wealthy donors, politicians pretending not to know who funded their campaigns, men in tuxedos shaking hands with people they'd arrest in daylight if they could. The kind of event where crime wears perfume and smiles for cameras. Serafina arrived late on purpose, as she often did, because timing was one of her favorite weapons. Grant was already there, charming as ever, playing the devoted husband. He kissed her cheek in front of the photographers, whispered something soft in her ear, and for a few minutes, if you didn't know better, they looked like the kind of couple magazines would call untouchable. But Serafina had spent too many years surviving by instinct, and that night, every instinct she had was screaming. So instead of staying on the floor, instead of playing the role expected of her, she slipped away, quietly, alone, no guards, no announcement. She moved through the private corridors of that hotel like a ghost that already knew where the body was hidden. When she reached the private lounge upstairs, the door wasn't fully closed. She heard Grant's voice first, low, smooth, careless. Then she heard a woman laugh. Not the nervous laugh of someone in danger, the confident laugh of someone who believed she had already won. Serafina pushed the door open, and what she saw in that room would have been enough to break most people. Grant wasn't just with another woman. He was with a woman Serafina knew, a woman who had spent months circling her social world with the kind of polished smile that never reached her eyes. Her name was Veronica Hale, elegant, ambitious, dangerous, in the way polished people are dangerous when they've spent their whole lives learning how to look harmless. Veronica wasn't just Grant's mistress. She was holding printed copies of confidential route schedules, offshore account details, private transfer codes, the names of captains who handled Serafina's most protected shipments. And Grant wasn't ashamed. He wasn't scrambling for excuses. He wasn't shocked that Serafina had found them. He looked at her with the calm of a man who had convinced himself he was finally in control. For a few seconds, no one spoke. That silence mattered. Because in stories like this, people expect the screaming. They expect the slap, the shattered glass, the dramatic breakdown. That's what weak people do when their hearts are broken in public. Serafina was not weak. She looked at the papers first, then at Veronica, then at Grant. And when she finally spoke, her voice was so calm it made both of them uneasy. She asked him one question. "How long?" Grant smirked, and that smirk cost him everything. He didn't deny it. He didn't apologize. He didn't beg. Men who are about to lose everything often confuse arrogance with safety. He said, "Long enough to learn that the queen is only powerful because everyone else is afraid to take what she has." B. Veronica smiled like she was watching history. Then Grant delivered the line he thought would destroy her. "I never loved the queen. I married the empire." If there had been a camera in that room, if anyone had been foolish enough to record the expression on Serafina's face in that exact second, they would have captured the moment a woman stopped grieving and started planning. People later said she should have killed him right there. Plenty of people expected it. Some even wanted it. A bullet in a private lounge. A scandal buried by money. A body moved before dawn. Clean. Fast. Final. But Serafina understood something Grant never did. Death is often too easy. Death can be merciful. Death can end pain. Real revenge, the kind that lives in the bones of people long after the bruises fade, is slower. It takes away what the person thought they'd keep. It makes them watch their own downfall in real time. It strips them of pride first, then safety, then allies, then hope. And that night, while Grant stood there feeling clever, and Veronica stood there feeling chosen, Serafina gave them the most terrifying response either of them could have imagined. She smiled. Not because she was okay, not because she forgave him, not because she didn't care. She smiled because the pain had already transformed into something much more useful. She looked at Grant, let the silence stretch, and said, "Then I'll make sure you live long enough to regret every second of it." Then she turned around and walked out. That was the moment everyone around her should have been afraid. Because the people who knew Serafina best understood the rules. If she screamed, there was still emotion left to exploit. If she cried, there was still softness left to reach. If she shot him, at least the outcome was simple. But if she smiled and walked away, that meant she was about to become patient. And patient women with power are the most dangerous creatures men like Grant ever meet. She left the gala without saying goodbye to anyone. No confrontation, no scene, no explanation. Her driver opened the SUV door. She waved him off. Then she got behind the wheel herself, something she almost never did. It was raining harder by then, the kind of hard rain that makes the whole city look like it's drowning in its own reflection. She drove without direction, past the towers she owned through shell companies, past the clubs where men toasted her name in private while pretending not to know her in public, past the bridges where deals were made in parked cars and broken promises. Her phone rang over and over. Merrick, her chief enforcer, her accountant, her security team. She ignored all of them. Some people think revenge begins with rage. It doesn't. Rage is messy. Revenge begins in the quiet. In the empty moments after humiliation, when the hurt is still fresh and the mind is suddenly colder than the heart, that is where Serafina was when she saw him. At first, he was just another figure in the rain. Another forgotten man on a forgotten corner, a shape under a flickering sign, half shadowed, half lit. But then she noticed the movement. Two drunk men were circling him, laughing, shoving him, taunting him. One kicked over the paper cup near his feet. The other grabbed the old blanket he'd been using to shield a small stray dog curled beside him. The man on the ground moved fast, faster than a homeless man with bruised ribs should have moved. He caught the attacker's wrist, twisted it hard enough to make the man scream, and rose in one fluid motion. Not clumsy, not panicked, controlled, precise. He took one punch to the face without flinching, then drove his shoulder into the bigger man hard enough to slam him into the brick wall. By the time Serafina stepped out of the SUV, both attackers were stumbling backward, suddenly aware they had chosen the wrong target. That was the first thing she noticed. The second thing was stranger. He didn't ask her for help, didn't look relieved to see a luxury vehicle, didn't rush toward money, didn't perform desperation. He stood there in soaked clothes, breathing hard, blood mixing with rain on his lip, one hand still shielding that stray dog behind him, and when his eyes met hers, there was no fear in them. That mattered. People feared Serafina, even when they didn't know exactly who she was. Power has a smell. It has posture. It has silence. But this man looked at her like he was assessing her, not admiring her. That alone made him different. She reached into her coat, pulled out a thick fold of cash, and held it out. He didn't even look at it. He looked at her hand, then at her face, and said, "Keep it." Most people would call that pride. Serafina knew better. That wasn't pride. That was control. He wasn't refusing money because he didn't need it. He was refusing because he didn't want to owe anyone. In her world, that kind of instinct usually belonged to dangerous men. She asked him what his name was. He hesitated for just a fraction too long. "Cole," he said. Not smoothly, not badly. Not. Just enough of a pause to make it clear that whether it was his real name or not, he had learned how to survive by giving strangers only what they could handle. She asked him why he was out there. He gave her the kind of answer people use when the real one is buried too deep to offer a stranger. Bad luck. Then she asked him a question she didn't fully understand herself until later. What do you want? Most people in his position would have said, food, shelter, money, warmth, another chance. But he looked at her for a long second, rain running down his face, and said, a reason not to disappear. There are moments in life when the right sentence arrives at exactly the wrong time. That was one of them. Serafina had just been betrayed by the one man she let close enough to wound her. She was standing in the rain, holding the remains of her trust like broken glass. And in front of her stood a man who looked like the city had already thrown him away. That combination created an idea so reckless, so cruel, so brilliant, that even Serafina would later wonder if she had made it, or if fate had simply put it in her hands. She stepped closer, close enough to smell rainwater, blood, and cold air on him, close enough to see that despite the dirt and the bruises and the exhaustion, there was something off about him. His posture was too balanced, his eyes were too alert, his hands were scarred in ways that didn't match street survival alone. This was not a man born to weakness. This was a man who had fallen from somewhere high or been thrown. She lifted his chin with one gloved finger, forcing him to look directly at her. Then she said it. Marry me. He didn't blink. That was the part that would haunt her later. No laugh, no confusion, no stunned disbelief, just stillness. She continued, each word calm, deliberate, lethal. Marry me. Get in my car. Wear my ring. Smile when I tell you to smile. Stand beside me in front of every person who ever thought they could humiliate me, and I will make the man who betrayed me beg for mercy. A sane man would have stepped back. A desperate man would have asked questions. A frightened man would have thought she was insane. But the man calling himself Cole did something far more unsettling. He smiled, slow, quiet, like a man who had just heard the first line of a story he already knew how to finish. He looked at her for several seconds, then glanced at the SUV behind her, then back at her again. And if I say yes? He asked. Serafina answered without hesitation. You stop being invisible tonight. He gave the smallest nod, then asked the question that should have warned her more than it did. And if I become yours, do I stay a prop, or do I get to play the role properly? Come in. That sentence landed harder than she expected, because it wasn't the language of a helpless man. It was the language of someone who understood performance, power, and consequences. She should have stopped. She should have walked away. She should have ordered her guards to search him, question him, break him down, verify every inch of his history. Instead, she opened the back door of the SUV herself. Get in, she said. He looked once more at the stray dog, crouched, placed the old blanket over it with a strange gentleness, then slid into the car like he belonged in leather seats and shadowed silence. Serafina got in after him, shut the door, and the convoy pulled away. Just like that. One sentence, one decision, one stranger. And the city kept moving, unaware that somewhere between that sidewalk and the road ahead, a queen had just chosen the instrument of her revenge. Inside the SUV, neither of them spoke for the first few minutes. That silence was not awkward. It was measured. Serafina watched him from the corner of her eye while pretending not to. Up close, he was even more confusing. The bruises were real. The exhaustion was real. The torn coat was real. But underneath all of that was composure she couldn't ignore. He didn't fidget. didn't gape at the interior, didn't ask where they were going, didn't ask if she was serious. He sat back like a man who had ridden in expensive cars before and simply no longer cared to be impressed by them. Eventually, Serafina broke the silence. "You're either very brave or very stupid." He turned his head toward her and answered, "Maybe I'm tired of being underestimated." She almost smiled. Almost. Then her phone buzzed again. This time, it was Grant. She stared at his name on the screen while the rain hammered the roof. He called. Once, twice, 3 times. Then a message appeared. "Where are you? We need to talk." Serafina handed the phone to the man beside her. "Answer it," she said. He looked at the phone, then at her, then pressed accept. Grant's voice came through immediately, irritated, urgent, still arrogant enough to believe he had options. "Serafina, listen to me. Whatever you think you saw, we can fix this." The man beside her didn't speak right away. That silence alone unsettled Grant. "Who is this? The fact?" Grant snapped. The man finally answered, and when he did, his voice was low, steady, almost amused. "The man sitting in your seat." Then he ended the call and handed the phone back. Serafina stared at him for the first time that night with something beyond curiosity. That line was too sharp, too perfect, too instinctive. Men like Grant were used to owning the room through charm. This stranger had just cut through all of that in one sentence. Serafina took the phone, ignored the incoming flood of messages, and said, "You learn fast." He looked out the window and replied, "No, I remember fast." There it was, again. Another sentence that didn't belong to the man he was pretending to be. Another crack in the image. Another warning she chose to set aside, because revenge, when it tastes fresh enough, can make smart people reckless. By the time the convoy reached Serafina's estate, the story had already started spreading. In her world, information moved faster than traffic, and more accurately than rumors ever should. Guards at the gate saw the unknown man. House staff saw the way she stepped out first, then waited for him instead of ordering him. Security saw her lead him through the main entrance instead of a side wing. That mattered. Every small detail mattered. The mansion itself looked less like a home and more like a fortress that had learned how to dress like luxury. Marble floors, black iron railings, massive windows, artwork worth fortunes, quiet hallways where people spoke softly because too many decisions in that house had ended lives. The moment she walked in with him, every person who served her knew something impossible had just happened. Marek arrived before they even reached the grand staircase. Tall, broad, scar across his jaw, the kind of man whose face looked permanently carved into suspicion. He took one look at the stranger, then at Serafina, and asked the question no one else was brave enough to ask. "Who is this?" Serafina didn't slow down. "My husband," she said. That single sentence hit the room like a gunshot. Marek actually stopped walking. One of the house staff dropped a tray in the distance. The stranger, still in torn clothes and soaked through, did not react. Again, that was the detail that mattered. Most men would have looked shocked, flattered, terrified. But others. He simply kept pace beside her, like he understood that once a powerful woman says a thing in front of witnesses, reality adjusts around her. Marek lowered his voice. "You're joking." Serafina turned, looked him dead in the eye, and said, "Have I ever looked like I was joking?" He had no answer for that. She ordered the house doctor upstairs, ordered the staff to prepare the east suite, ordered security to search every entry point twice, ordered the tailor on call to come immediately, ordered the legal team woken up, ordered the jeweler, ordered the priest who handled private family ceremonies, ordered everyone fast, efficient, ruthless. If Grant had hoped he still had time to regain control, that hope was already dying. Because Serafina didn't just threaten people, she made decisions so quickly they became facts before anyone had time to resist them. And that night, before the rain had even stopped, she was building a marriage out of fury, humiliation, and something far more dangerous than either of those things: instinct. Upstairs, while staff scrambled and security whispered, the man calling himself Cole sat in a chair while the house doctor cleaned the cut on his lip. Serafina stood near the window, watching the storm slide down the glass, and for the first time since leaving the gala, the adrenaline began to settle just enough for doubt to creep in. What exactly had she done? She had brought a stranger into the most secure place she owned. She had announced a marriage before learning the truth about him. She had chosen a weapon she hadn't tested. It was reckless. It was impulsive. It was beneath the standards she had spent years building. But when she turned and looked at him, doubt didn't disappear. It changed shape. Because even sitting there, bruised and half-broken, he looked less like a rescued man and more like someone waiting to be restored. The doctor finished, left the room, and Serafina finally asked the question that mattered. "Tell me why I shouldn't regret this." He met her eyes and answered without hesitation. "Because the man who hurt you already thinks he knows what you'll do next. I don't." That was not the answer of a drifter. That was the answer of someone who understood strategy. She should have asked more. She should have pressed harder. Instead, she moved closer, close enough to study his face properly under the warm light. Cleaned up even slightly, he looked even more dangerous. Strong jaw, eyes too steady, old scars near his collarbone, hands marked by violence, not just poverty. She asked, "Who taught you to fight?" He held her gaze for a beat too long and said, "The same thing that teaches everyone eventually: loss." It was a clever answer, but not a full one. Serafina recognized evasion when she heard it. Yet she let it pass. Not because she believed him, but because she had already decided that whatever he was, she would use it. "Listen carefully," she said. "This is not romance. This is not rescue. This is not a fairy tale. You will wear what I tell you to wear, say what I tell you to say, stand where I tell you to stand. If you betray me, you won't live long enough to regret it." He rose slowly from the chair, stepped close enough that the air between them tightened, and answered in a voice so calm it almost sounded intimate. "Then don't make the mistake of thinking I'm the only one who should be careful." And just like that, the first real spark passed between them. Not love, not trust. Something more volatile: recognition. Because what happened next is where the story truly stopped being revenge and started becoming something far more dangerous. By dawn, the city would wake up to whispers that the most feared woman in the underworld had dragged a stranger out of the rain and made him her husband. By noon, her ex-husband would see the first photograph and realize his plan to humiliate her had backfired in a way he could not yet understand. By nightfall, the man in the torn coat would no longer look like a beggar at all. But here is the part no one saw coming. The stranger Serafina brought home was hiding far more than a name. And before the wedding ring ever touched his hand, there were already men in that city who would have panicked if they knew exactly who had just entered her mansion. Because Serafina thought she had picked up a broken man to use as a weapon, the truth was much worse for everyone standing in her way. She may have just brought by the time the first gray light of morning touched the windows of Serafina Vale's estate, the man she had pulled from the street no longer looked like someone the city had forgotten. He still wore bruises, and the cut on his lip still marked him with the remains of the night before, but the transformation had already begun. In houses built on power, change happens fast when the person at the top decides it will. Tailors arrived before sunrise. The private barber was called in. The estate's physician had already treated the worst of his injuries. Fresh clothes were laid out. Security teams rotated through the halls twice as often as usual. Every member of Serafina's inner circle had been summoned, whether they liked it or not. And in the middle of all that movement, all that tension, all that barely controlled panic, the stranger from the rain sat in silence while an empire quietly rearranged itself around him. It should have felt ridiculous. It should have looked absurd. Instead, for reasons no one could explain yet, it looked like something that had been waiting to happen. Marek was the first to understand that the real problem wasn't the speed of Serafina's decision, it was how comfortable the stranger seemed inside it. Men who are dragged into power by accident usually reveal themselves quickly. They touch things they shouldn't. They ask the wrong questions. They look overwhelmed by luxury. They react too much. This man did none of that. When the barber approached him, he didn't flinch. When the tailor measured him, he stood with the posture of someone who had worn custom suits before. When a housemaid brought him coffee, he thanked her without looking confused by the silver tray or the imported porcelain cup. Marek stood in the doorway and watched every detail, his suspicion sharpening with every passing second. The stranger noticed, of course. Men like Marek always believe they are the only ones doing the observing. Finally, after the others left, Marek stepped into the room and asked the question he had been asking himself all morning. "Who the hell are you really?" The man looked at him, calm as ever, and said, "Right now? The reason your queen slept for the first time all night?" Marek did not smile. But he did understand one thing. This was not going to be simple. In another part of the house, Serafina stood in front of a mirror while one of her assistants fastened the clasp on a dark silk robe. And for the first time since the gala, she allowed herself to replay what had happened without interruption. Grant's face, Veronica's smile, the papers on the table, the sentence that had split something open inside her. I married the empire. She had spent hours moving forward so fast that emotion couldn't catch up. But now, in the quiet of early morning, the weight of humiliation finally landed. Not because she had been betrayed. Betrayal was familiar territory in her world. People lied. People stole. People switched loyalties when money changed hands. None of that was new. What cut deeper was that she had broken her own rules. She had trusted someone outside the system. She had made herself vulnerable for something soft, something ordinary, something she had convinced herself was safe. And now every person who had warned her was somewhere in the house, too disciplined to say, "I told you so," but thinking it all the same. That kind of pain doesn't always create tears. Sometimes it creates a colder kind of decision, and Serafina was not the type of woman who stayed broken for long. When she entered the dressing room where the stranger was waiting, even she had to stop for half a second. The torn coat was gone. The wet hair had been cut and pushed back. The beard had been trimmed down to a shadow that sharpened rather than softened his face. He wore black slacks, a crisp white shirt left open at the collar, and the unfinished look somehow made him more dangerous than if he'd been fully dressed. The bruises were still there, but instead of making him look weak, they made him look like a man who had survived something violent and remained standing anyway. And then there were the scars. Faint ones near his neck, older ones across his hands, one disappearing beneath the open collar of his shirt. Not random, not clumsy, not the scattered marks of street fights and bad luck. These were cleaner, older, more deliberate, and Serafina's assistant quietly excused herself, leaving the two of them alone. The stranger held her gaze in the mirror and said, "You're staring." Serafina stepped closer without breaking eye contact. "I'm trying to decide whether I picked up a beggar or adopted a problem." He gave the faintest smile. "Those two things aren't always different. There is a specific kind of tension that forms when two people are pretending for everyone else but can't quite keep the lie from changing shape in private. That tension was already there, and both of them knew it." Serafina moved around him slowly, studying the fit of the shirt, the way he carried himself, the way he didn't shift under scrutiny the way weaker men always did. "The tailor says your measurements were easy," she said. "That usually means someone's been dressed properly before." He adjusted one cuff and answered, "Maybe I've had better days." She stepped in front of him and fixed the collar herself, her fingers brushing his throat in a way that should have felt purely practical. It didn't. He stayed perfectly still, but his eyes changed. Not softer, sharper, more aware. "If this is going to work," she said quietly, "you need to understand something. Men will test you because they think you don't belong here. Women will look at you because they'll be curious. Everyone will assume you're weak. If you embarrass me, I will bury you." He looked down at her hand, still resting near his collar, and said, "Then maybe don't touch me like that if you want me to remember this is business." Serafina removed her hand immediately, though not because she was startled, because he was right, and she hated that he was right. The room went quiet, in the kind of way that makes every second feel more deliberate than the one before it. Then she turned away, reached for a velvet box on the table, and opened it. Inside was a ring. Not the one she had once worn for Grant. That ring was already gone, removed the second she left the gala, and locked away where she never intended to see it again. This one was new, heavy, masculine. Black gold, with a dark stone set in the center, discreet enough to look elegant, powerful enough to be unmistakable. She held it out. "If you're doing this, you wear this." He didn't reach for it. "You put it on me," he said. That should have irritated her. Instead, something about the quiet confidence of the request pulled her in. She took his hand. Warm, strong, scarred, slid the ring onto his finger. It fit perfectly, which bothered her more than it should have. "Convenient," he murmured. "I had it sized while you were sleeping," she replied. He looked at the ring, then at her. "So you were serious." Serafina met his gaze. "I stopped being anything else the moment my husband decided to make me a fool." And there it was again. That word, husband, not former husband, not ex-husband, not traitor. Somewhere inside her, Serafina still hadn't fully shifted from grief into detachment, and the stranger beside her noticed it. People often assume the most observant person in the room is the one doing the questioning. In reality, it's usually the one saying the least. He watched the small tightening in her jaw, the slight change in her breathing, the way her eyes hardened whenever Grant's shadow passed through her thoughts. "You still want him to hurt," he said. It wasn't a question. Serafina turned toward the window and folded her arms. "No," she answered. "After. I want him to understand." He gave a quiet laugh that almost sounded darkly impressed. "That's worse." She looked back at him. "You say that like you approve." He stepped closer, not enough to invade, just enough to make the space between them feel charged. I say it like I know the difference between anger and intention. That line stayed with her longer than she admitted, because it was exactly right. Grant expected anger. He expected screaming, legal threats, public chaos, broken glass, maybe even violence. What he did not expect was Serafina building a replacement so quickly that by the time he understood what was happening, the humiliation would already be irreversible. And humiliation was coming. By late morning, the first phase of Serafina's revenge had been set in motion. Calls went out to the few people who mattered. Private invitations were sent. A small ceremony was arranged for that evening, intimate enough to remain controlled, public enough within the right circles to become impossible to ignore. She did not want a spectacle for the whole city. She wanted something more precise. She wanted the people whose opinions moved money, loyalty, and fear to see her standing beside another man less than 24 hours after Grant had tried to humiliate her. She wanted the underworld to understand that if anyone thought betrayal would weaken her, they had miscalculated. And most of all, she wanted Grant to receive the news from someone else, not from her. Not from a threat, not from a confrontation. She wanted it to arrive as fact. The legal team drafted papers. The private priest confirmed availability. The jeweler delivered a second ring. House staff prepared the West Hall for the ceremony. Security doubled again. Every detail moved with the speed of a military operation, disguised as elegance. But in the center of all of it was still the same unanswered question. Who was the man she was about to place at her side? That question became harder to ignore when the first weapons check happened. It was standard procedure in Serafina's house, especially when someone new was being integrated into any part of the estate. Marek ordered a full sweep. The stranger was searched by two of the most trusted men in the house. They found no hidden blades, no wire, no tracking device, no burner phone, no identifying documents, no wallet, no keys, no nothing. That should have been reassuring. Instead, it made Marek more suspicious, because men on the street often carry scraps of their lives with them, even if they have nothing else. A picture, a folded receipt, a keychain, a worn-out ID. This man carried emptiness like he had practiced it. Nothing, one of the guards reported. Marek looked at the stranger and said, "That's the problem." The stranger shrugged. "Maybe I'm clean." Marek stepped closer. "Or maybe you're trained." There was a beat of silence, and then the stranger replied, "You keep saying maybe like you don't already have an answer in your head." Marek leaned in enough for the threat to feel real. "If you're lying to her, I'll know." The stranger's expression didn't change. "Then we have something in common." By mid-afternoon, the estate had become a machine built around one purpose: making the impossible look inevitable. The man from the street was taken to the wardrobe room and dressed in the first complete version of what Serafina intended the world to see. Black tailored suit, white shirt, dark tie, minimal jewelry. No flashy arrogance, no overdone excess. Serafina understood the power of restraint. The goal wasn't to make him look rich. It was to make him look like he belonged next to her so completely that everyone would question their own assumptions. When he stepped out wearing the full suit for the first time, even the staff forgot themselves for a moment. It wasn't just that he looked good. Plenty of men look good in expensive clothes. It was the way the clothes seemed to remember him, the way his shoulders settled into the jacket, the way his hands adjusted the cuffs without hesitation. The way he moved through the room like elegance was not something he was borrowing, but something he had once lost and now recognized. Serafina watched him from across the room and felt something deeply inconvenient move through her. Attraction was manageable. Curiosity was dangerous. But fascination? Fascination had ruined smarter people than her. There is always a moment in revenge stories when the person seeking revenge realizes the plan is starting to affect them too, not the target, themselves. For Serafina, that moment came when she walked up to him to straighten his tie. It was supposed to be simple, practical, symbolic, but she placed one hand lightly against his chest, the other at his collar, and looked down at the knot. He looked down at her. That should have been nothing. But there are silences that say more than conversations. The warmth beneath her palm, the steady rise and fall of his breathing, the way he remained perfectly still while the space between them narrowed, all of it shifted the air in that room. She tightened the tie and said, "Don't make me regret this." His hand came up, slowly, and covered hers against his chest. Not rough, not rushed, just firm enough to make it impossible to ignore. "You keep saying that," he said quietly. "Maybe you're more afraid of liking this than regretting it." Serafina looked up immediately, and for one reckless second she almost kissed him. Instead, she stepped back, cold again, in an instant. "Remember your role." He released her hand. "That's exactly what I'm trying to do." Meanwhile, Grant Mercer was beginning to understand that something was wrong, but not yet how wrong. After the call in the SUV, after the stranger's voice on the other end, after the humiliating silence that followed, Grant had done what men like him always do when their control slips. He convinced himself the damage could still be contained. He called, texted, sent private messages through mutual contacts. Tried to reach Serafina through lawyers, through assistants, through people who knew better than to get involved, but did it anyway, because Grant still had enough charm to confuse weakness with influence. By noon, he had heard the rumor. By 1 o'clock, he had dismissed it as an empty threat. By 2, he had learned the private priest had been summoned. By 3, one of Veronica's social contacts confirmed that a jeweler had been called to the estate. By 4, Grant stopped pretending he wasn't afraid, because Serafina didn't make emotional moves. She made statements, and if she was really doing this, if she was actually placing another man at her side less than a day after discovering his betrayal, then it meant she was not grieving him. She was replacing him. There is no wound to the ego quite like being made irrelevant in real time. Veronica, of course, handled the news badly. She had imagined herself as the woman who would stand where Serafina once stood. That is the mistake ambitious people make when they confuse access with elevation. Veronica thought taking Grant from Serafina would weaken Serafina. She thought proximity to a husband meant proximity to an empire. But she did not understand what everyone else in that world already knew. Grant had never been the power. He had only been standing near it. And now, the rumor that Serafina had taken a stranger from the street and turned him into a husband overnight was already making Veronica feel the first cold edge of panic. "She's bluffing," Veronica told Grant, though her voice lacked conviction. "No one would take her seriously if she does this." Grant stared at his phone, jaw tight, eyes darker than usual. "That's what you don't understand," he said. "If she says it happened, it happened." Veronica tried to hold on to the illusion of control. "Then expose him. Find out who he is. Make her look insane." Grant looked at her then, and for the first time, she saw something she had not expected. Jealousy, not strategic concern. Not financial fear, jealousy. Because whatever else Grant had done, whatever lies he had told, some possessive part of him had still believed Serafina would remain emotionally tethered to him. The idea of another man touching what he once claimed as his was already poisoning him. Back at the estate, Serafina made one final decision before the ceremony that would shape everything that came after. She ordered her staff to prepare the West Hall instead of the chapel. That mattered because the chapel would have made the marriage feel traditional, sacred, almost innocent. The West Hall was something else entirely. High ceilings, dark walls, candlelight reflected on polished stone, white roses arranged in long, elegant lines. A private room that looked like a place where vows and threats could coexist without contradiction. She did not want innocence. She wanted control. The guest list was small and deliberate. Her attorney, the priest, 2 old family allies, Marek, 3 captains whose loyalty mattered, 1 judge who owed her favors, a woman who handled offshore transfers. And because Serafina understood the value of humiliation, 1 mutual acquaintance she knew would make sure the news reached the right ears before midnight. Every person in that room would understand exactly what the ceremony meant. This was not a love story. It was a message. Or at least, that is what Serafina told herself while the stranger stood in the next room, adjusting his cuffs in front of a mirror like he had been born to wear a crown no one had seen yet. When he entered the West Hall, the atmosphere changed in a way no one was prepared for. It was not simply that he looked transformed. It was that he looked composed. That is a different thing entirely. Men can be polished and still reveal uncertainty. Men can be attractive and still look borrowed. This man did not. He walked in with the kind of quiet control that forces people to recalculate in real time. Marek noticed it. The captains noticed it. The judge noticed it. The old family allies exchanged a look they hoped no one saw. Even Serafina, standing at the far end of the room in a dark fitted gown that made her look more queen than bride, felt a small, sharp pulse of awareness when he came to stand beside her. The priest opened the ceremony book. The room settled. The stranger looked at Serafina once, briefly, and in that glance there was something she had not expected. Not fear, not gratitude, not opportunism, commitment. It was too strong a word for what they were doing, too intimate a concept for what had begun as revenge. And yet it was there, unmistakable, like he had made some private decision the rest of them had not been invited to hear. The vows were short because Serafina insisted on efficiency. No speeches, no sentimental stories, no indulgent declarations. The legal documents had already been prepared. The witnesses had been chosen. The language was clean and binding. When it was time for the rings, Serafina placed his first. Her hand was steady, but the contact felt different now in front of witnesses. More public, more dangerous, more intimate than she had intended. Then he took her hand. That was when the first real disruption happened. Most men, especially men suddenly elevated into wealth and danger, would have been nervous. He wasn't. He lifted her hand with a slowness that felt almost ceremonial, slid the ring onto her finger, then held her gaze for 1 second too long before letting go. It was such a small thing. So subtle most people would miss it, but Serafina didn't miss it. Neither did Marek. Neither did the captains. That wasn't the gesture of a man overwhelmed by circumstance. It was the gesture of a man making a claim. The priest pronounced them married. No applause followed, just silence. The kind of silence that comes when a room full of dangerous people realizes history has just shifted and no one knows yet whether they should be impressed or afraid. The first photograph was taken less than 2 minutes later. Serafina standing with one hand resting lightly against her new husband's chest, chin lifted, expression unreadable. Him beside her, dark suit, bruised lip, ring visible, one hand at her waist, as if the position had always belonged to him. It was elegant. It was sharp. It was devastating. She approved it instantly and gave one simple instruction. Send it. Not to the press. Not publicly. Not yet. She wanted the wound to travel through the right channels first. Private circles. Private phones. Private groups where rich people pretend their gossip is confidential. She wanted Grant to receive it from someone he respected enough to be embarrassed by. And that is exactly what happened. Less than 10 minutes later, Grant's phone lit up with the image. Then another from a different contact. Then another. Same photo. Same angle. Same message without words. Replaced. He stared at the screen so long Veronica had to ask twice what was wrong. When he finally showed her, the room went quiet. Serafina did not look heartbroken. She looked magnificent. And the man beside her did not look like a joke. He looked like a threat. Grant's first reaction was denial. His second was rage. His third, though he would never admit it aloud, was something far uglier: fear. It is difficult for people like Grant to process being discarded. They are built on the assumption that they can always return, always explain, always manipulate emotion back into usefulness. But Serafina had skipped every stage he expected. No tears, no public scandal, no begging, no drawn-out confrontation. She had simply moved. That kind of speed feels unnatural when you are the one being left behind. He called her again, straight to voicemail. He texted, no response. He sent a message through Marek. No reply. Finally, in a move that exposed more desperation than strategy, he drove to the estate himself. That was the kind of mistake men make when they still believe their former access means the rules don't apply to them anymore. The gates did not open. The guards did not greet him by name. The man who had once walked into that house like family was now left standing in the rain outside the iron entrance, while two armed guards informed him he was not authorized to enter. "You can't be serious," Grant snapped. "This is my house." One of the guards, a man who had served Serafina long enough to enjoy this moment more than he should have, answered calmly. "It used to be." Grant demanded to see her, demanded explanations, demanded anything that would let him pretend he still had leverage. Instead, the gates remained closed. And then, through the bars, he saw them. Serafina and her new husband appeared at the top of the front steps, under the covered entryway, framed by warm light and cold rain. She was wrapped in a dark coat over her gown, still wearing the wedding ring he had once imagined would always belong to him. The man beside her stood half a step behind at first, then moved forward until he was exactly at her side. That detail was deliberate. Grant saw it. He saw the ring on the man's hand. He saw Serafina's calm face. He saw the way the stranger's hand settled at the small of her back, like he already understood where to stand. "Serafina!" Grant shouted through the rain. "This is insane." She didn't move, didn't raise her voice, didn't offer a single shred of the emotional chaos he was begging for. "No," she said. "This is efficient." Grant laughed in disbelief, but there was nothing amused in it. "You married some homeless stranger to make me jealous?" Serafina looked at him for a moment that felt much longer than it was. "No, Grant, I married him so you'd understand how replaceable you really are." That sentence would have been enough to cripple most men. But then, the stranger, did something worse. He leaned down, said something private near Serafina's ear that made her lips curve in the faintest smile, and Grant lost what little composure he had left. Jealousy is a revealing emotion. It strips away intelligence first. Grant shouted insults, called the marriage fake, called the man a fraud, threatened exposure, threatened lawsuits, threatened to tell everyone Serafina had lost control. But the louder he got, the more ridiculous he looked. And that was the brilliance of Serafina's move. She didn't need to destroy him physically. Not yet. She only needed to let him perform his own humiliation in front of armed men who would repeat every word to the rest of the city by dawn. Finally, the stranger stepped forward just enough for his voice to carry. "You should leave," he said. Grant sneered. "And who the hell are you to tell me anything?" The stranger's answer came without hesitation. "The man standing where you never deserved to be." Serafina did not look at him, but she felt the effect of that sentence immediately. Grant froze for half a beat, and in that half beat, the balance of power shifted again. It was the same instinctive sharpness he had shown in the SUV, the same calm precision, too good, too natural, too practiced. Serafina filed it away, even as a dangerous warmth spread through her chest that had absolutely no place in a revenge marriage. That night, after Grant finally left in fury and the gates locked behind him, the estate should have settled. Instead, it grew quieter in the way large houses do, when everyone knows something is changing and no one knows whether to celebrate or prepare for violence. Serafina dismissed most of the staff. The guests were gone. The legal documents were secured. The rings were on. The marriage was official in every way that mattered. She should have gone to her own suite and locked the night behind her. Instead, she found herself walking toward the east wing where she had placed her new husband. The door to his room was slightly open. He stood inside, near the window, jacket off, tie loosened, shirt collar open again, looking out over the dark grounds. She didn't announce herself. "You handled him well," she said. He turned slowly. Was that a compliment? She leaned against the doorway. "Don't get used to them." He studied her for a second. "You're not sleeping." She almost laughed. "I got married to a stranger 12 hours after discovering my husband was sleeping with another woman and selling pieces of my empire. Sleep isn't high on the list." He nodded, like that made perfect sense. "Then come in." She should have refused. She didn't. Some of the most dangerous moments in stories like this don't happen during gunfire or betrayal. They happen in quiet rooms after midnight, when two people who should not trust each other start telling the truth in fragments. Serafina stepped inside and closed the door behind her. Not locked, just closed. He poured her a drink without asking what she wanted, and the fact that he chose exactly what she usually drank without being told made her pause. "Lucky guess?" she asked. He handed her the glass. "Good instincts." She took a slow sip, watching him over the rim. "You keep saying things that don't fit the man you claim to be." He didn't deny it. "Maybe I'm a quick study." She set the glass down. "Maybe you're lying." He stepped closer. Not close enough to touch, close enough to make the room feel smaller. "Everyone lies, Serafina. The difference is what they're lying for." The fact that he used her name without title should have irritated her. Instead, it sounded dangerous, personal. Like he was already stepping over lines other people were too afraid to approach. "And what are you lying for?" she asked. He held her gaze. "Survival. Same as everyone else in your world." She wanted to press harder. She wanted to demand answers. But there was something else moving between them now, and both of them knew it. Serafina made the mistake of stepping too close when she reached for her glass again. Her shoulder brushed his chest, barely, but the contact was enough to change the air. He looked down at her. She looked up at him. And then, for the first time since the rain, the idea that this marriage was supposed to be fake felt suddenly fragile. "You're staring again," he said quietly. She kept her voice cool. "I'm evaluating an investment." He gave a low laugh. "That's not what this looks like." She should have walked out. She should have reminded him of boundaries. Instead, she said the most reckless thing she had said all day. "And what does it look like?" And. He answered by lifting one hand, slowly, deliberately, stopping just short of her waist, waiting to see if she would stop him. She didn't. His fingers rested lightly against her side, firm enough to be undeniable. "It looks like you married me for revenge," he said, voice lower now, "and you're starting to wonder whether that was the only reason." The truth hit her harder because it was too close. She stepped back instantly, regaining distance before desire could make her careless. "Don't confuse chemistry with privilege," she said. He let his hand fall. "Don't confuse control with honesty." That line followed her out of the room and into the next day, where the consequences of the marriage began unfolding faster than either of them expected. By morning, the underworld was split into two camps. One camp thought Serafina had made a bold, brilliant move that proved she remained untouchable. The other thought she had finally cracked under emotional pressure and made a reckless decision that could weaken her from within. The truth, as always, was more complicated. Her allies admired the speed. Her enemies smelled opportunity. Her accountants worried about legal exposure. Her captains worried about trust. Her rivals worried about what it meant if the stranger was more than he appeared. And Marek, who trusted almost no one on principle, had already begun digging quietly, thoroughly. He had no intention of letting Serafina walk blind into a trap simply because she was angry enough to call it strategy. By noon, he had already sent 3 separate inquiries through private channels. Facial recognition, old booking photos, shelter records, hospital logs, closed case databases. Nothing clean came back that should have made the stranger impossible to trace. Instead, it made him feel curated, erased. And in Marek's line of work, erased people were often the ones who had once mattered most. Serafina, meanwhile, had another problem. She was beginning to enjoy how angry Grant was becoming. That might sound simple, but it wasn't. Revenge can be addictive, especially when it starts working faster than expected. Every message Grant sent grew more desperate. First came anger, then threats, then accusations. Then the first note of pleading. He demanded a meeting. She refused. He demanded legal access to accounts. She froze him out. He demanded to know who the man was. She sent no answer. Finally, in a move so petty and effective that even Marek almost approved, Serafina had a second photograph delivered through private channels. This one was worse. She and her new husband seated together at breakfast on the terrace, sunlight across the table, his hand resting on hers like it belonged there. Not dramatic, not sexual, worse, intimate, calm, domestic. The exact kind of image designed to suggest he had already settled into the place Grant once believed was permanently his. When Grant saw it, something inside him shifted from outrage into obsession. Because betrayal he could justify, loss he could fight, but replacement? Replacement is the wound narcissists never survive gracefully. And then came the first crack in the stranger's story. It happened in the training room. Serafina had gone there to clear her head, as she often did when emotion threatened discipline. The room was private, reinforced, filled with everything from knives to firearms to mats for close combat. She expected to be alone. Instead, she found him there, sleeves rolled, tie discarded, standing in front of the knife table with one blade already in his hand. He looked up when she entered, not startled, just aware. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked. He twirled the knife once, casually, expertly, and set it down with far too much familiarity. "Habit," he said. Serafina crossed the room slowly. Most homeless men don't know how to handle a combat blade. He picked up another, weighed it in his palm. Maybe most people assume too much. She took a knife herself, and without warning, threw it hard toward the target board across the room. It landed clean. He watched, then threw his own, without even looking fully at the board. Bullseye. Not lucky. Not close. Perfect. Serafina turned to him fully then, all softness gone. "Who are you?" "Ha, ah, ha, 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 ha," she asked. He met her eyes and answered with a question of his own. "If I told you the truth right now, would you still want me standing beside you?" She hated that she couldn't answer immediately. That hesitation told her more about herself than she wanted to admit, because the correct answer should have been simple. Truth first, loyalty first, control first. But the real answer was more dangerous. The real answer was that she had started to depend on his presence faster than she had intended. She had started to feel calmer when he entered a room. She had started to notice where he stood without looking for him. She had started to feel the exact kind of pull she had sworn never to feel again, and that terrified her because the timing was obscene. "You don't get to answer my questions with riddles," she said coldly. He set the knife down and stepped closer. "Then stop asking questions you're not ready to hear answers to." She should have ordered him out. Instead, she attacked, fast, controlled. "Ha, ha, 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 ha." One strike aimed at his shoulder just to test reflexes. He blocked it instantly. She moved again. He caught her wrist. She twisted. He stepped in. In seconds, they were locked in close combat. Not a real fight, but not a game either. Breath close, bodies closer. The edge between violence and desire disappearing with every movement. Finally, he pinned her wrist against the mat wall, his body close enough to trap but not crush, both of them breathing harder now for reasons that had nothing to do with training. For a long second, neither of them moved. Her pulse was too loud. His grip was firm but controlled. She could have called guards, could have kneed him, bitten him, broken the hold. She did none of those things. "Let go," she said, but the command lacked force. He looked at her like he knew that. "Say it like you mean it." That should have infuriated her. Instead, it sent a sharp line of heat through her that made her angrier at herself than at him. "You're forgetting your place," she said. He leaned in just enough for his voice to drop near her ear. "No, I know exactly where I am." Then he released her immediately, stepped back, and left the room before she could decide whether to slap him or kiss him. Serafina stood there alone, furious, breathless, and more shaken than she had been during the entire wedding. Because, for the first time since Grant's betrayal, another man had touched her, and instead of feeling grief, she had felt danger of a very different kind. That is how these stories shift, not all at once. One touch, one sentence, one moment where the lie becomes harder to separate from the truth. By the end of that week, Serafina's revenge marriage had stopped feeling like a stunt and started feeling like a problem no one knew how to categorize. The stranger had adapted too quickly. He learned the household rhythms, he remembered names, he knew when to speak and when silence was stronger. He never overreached in public, but he never looked intimidated either. Women in Serafina's circles noticed him immediately, which irritated her far more than she would ever admit. Men tested him with subtle insults and veiled jokes, only to discover that he had an unnerving talent for returning comments so cleanly that they walked away looking foolish. At one private dinner, an older captain made the mistake of saying, "Funny how fast street trash can learn table manners." The stranger smiled, set down his glass, and replied, Funny how men who've had luxury their whole lives still don't know when to stay quiet." The room froze. Then Serafina, against all better judgment, nearly smiled. That was the moment she knew she was in trouble. Not because he had embarrassed a captain, because some part of her enjoyed it too much. Grant's obsession, meanwhile, was becoming more reckless. He hired private investigators. He leaned on former contacts in Serafina's network. He tried to bribe house staff and got nowhere. He started drinking more. Veronica, who had expected triumph, was now living with a man unraveling in real time. Every mention of the stranger made Grant more unstable. Every rumor about Serafina appearing at dinners with him, placing a hand on his arm, allowing him closer than expected, drove him harder toward humiliation and rage. He told himself the marriage was fake. He repeated it like a prayer. He told Veronica it was all for show. He told his lawyer it would be easy to expose. But then the next report came in. Serafina had introduced the man to 2 offshore banking contacts. Serafina had seated him beside her at a private negotiation. Serafina had given him access to a restricted wing of the estate. Whether it was performance or not, she was integrating him, and that possibility hit Grant harder than the affair itself. Because the one thing he had always counted on was Serafina's inability to trust again quickly. If she had found someone she was willing to risk that for, even as a tactic, then Grant's entire sense of superiority was collapsing under him. The real turning point came late one night when Serafina woke from a nightmare. She never admitted to nightmares, not to anyone, but betrayal changes sleep. She sat up in bed, breathing hard, the memory of Grant's face and the private lounge and the papers on the table all still too close, too sharp. For a few seconds, she didn't know what had pulled her awake. Then she heard it. Footsteps outside her door. Soft, measured, not sneaking, guarding. She rose, crossed the room, and opened the door quietly. He was there, sitting in a chair in the hall, jacket off, sleeves rolled, head turned slightly toward the far end of the corridor like he had been listening for movement. He stood the moment he saw her. "Why are you here?" she asked. He answered without hesitation. "Because your security is good, but your enemies are motivated, and tonight you look tired." That answer landed somewhere deep and unwelcome. "I didn't ask you to stand outside my door." He held her gaze. "You didn't have to." She should have sent him away. Instead, she looked at the chair, then at him, and asked the question that changed the night. "Did you stay there all night?" He glanced toward the window, where dawn had not yet broken. "Not all night," he said. "Only after I heard you stop sleeping." There are some acts of protection that mean more than grand gestures because they arrive without being requested. That is what made this moment dangerous. Not the fact that he was there, the fact that he had noticed, that he had listened, that he had chosen to stand watch without turning it into a performance. Serafina was not used to that. Men offered her loyalty when they wanted reward. They offered protection when they wanted favor. They offered affection when they wanted access. But this felt quieter, less transactional. And quiet things can be harder to defend against than dramatic ones. She should have thanked him and closed the door. Instead, she stepped aside. "Come in." He hesitated only briefly, then entered. She poured 2 drinks without asking if he wanted one. He took it. They sat across from each other in the low light of her private sitting room, and for several minutes neither spoke. Finally, she asked the question she had avoided since the rain. "What happened to you?" He looked into his glass instead of at her. "You really want the truth?" She nodded once. He lifted his eyes, slowly. "No, you don't. Not yet." That should have ended the conversation. Instead, it made her want to cross the room and force the truth out of him with her hands. Instead, she said, "You think you know me already." He leaned back slightly, expression unreadable. "I know enough." She narrowed her eyes. "And what is that?" He answered, in the same calm tone that had become increasingly dangerous to her. "I know you married me to punish a man. I know you expected me to stand still and look useful. I know you don't trust me. I know you want to. And I know every time you look at me, you're angry because some part of you already does. There are truths that sound insulting only because they are accurate." Serafina's first instinct was denial. Her second was attack. Her third, which she hated, was silence. He saw it. Of course he saw it. Then he set his glass down, stood, and crossed the room slowly. "If you want me gone," he said, "say it." She looked up at him, pulse suddenly louder than it should have been. "And if I don't?" He bent slightly, close enough now that the air between them felt charged, dangerous, intimate, in a way neither of them could pretend was accidental. "Then stop looking at me like I'm a weapon you accidentally pointed at yourself." That was the sentence. The one that broke the last fragile wall between anger and desire. Serafina kissed him first. Hard, fast, not tender, not hesitant. It was not a confession. It was not surrender. It was the kind of kiss that happens when 2 dangerous people stop pretending the tension isn't there and decide to test whether it can survive contact. He responded instantly, one hand at her waist, the other braced against the arm of the chair beside her, not overpowering, not soft either. The kiss was sharp, with everything they had both been refusing to name: her betrayal, his secrets, her rage, his restraint, her need for control, his refusal to be treated like a prop. It lasted only seconds, maybe less, but when she pulled back, the room had changed. So had they. "That was a mistake," she said immediately, because she had to say something. He looked at her mouth, then at her eyes. "No," he said quietly, "that was honesty." She stood too fast, putting distance between them before desire could turn into weakness. "This changes nothing." He didn't move. "Keep telling yourself that." She pointed to the door. "Leave." He obeyed. That mattered too. No argument, no smirk, no demand for more. He left her alone with a racing pulse and the kind of silence that makes a woman realize she has crossed a line she cannot uncross. The next morning, Marek arrived with the first real piece of information, and it was enough to make the entire house colder. He entered Serafina's private office without waiting to be announced, which meant the news was serious. She looked up from a ledger and saw it immediately in his face. "What is it?" Marek closed the door behind him and placed a thin file on the desk. "Your husband?" he said, the word sounding like it physically offended him. "He doesn't exist." Serafina opened the file. Inside were failed database pulls, incomplete records, erased identifiers, fragments of old case references, and one image, too grainy to be certain, but too close to ignore. A younger version of the man in her house, cleaner, harder, standing beside people who were all now either dead, imprisoned, or disappeared. No clear labels, no usable names. Just enough to prove one thing: he had not fallen into her life by accident. "There's more," Marek said. "The little I could trace doesn't point to shelters or petty crime. It points to sealed records, erased financial routes, and a family name somebody buried very carefully years ago." Serafina looked up slowly. "Whose family?" Marek's jaw tightened. "I don't know yet. But whoever he is, he's not just some man from the street." That should have been enough to end it. Enough to expose him, isolate him, throw him in the basement, put a gun in his mouth, and demand the truth. That is what the old Serafina would have done. That is what Marek expected. Instead, Serafina closed the file, slid it back across the desk, and said the words that made Marek stare at her like he no longer recognized the woman he served. "Keep digging." Quietly, Marek's expression hardened. "That's it?" She met his gaze without blinking. "That's what I said." He lowered his voice. "You kissed him, didn't you?" The question landed like a slap because it was so direct, and because Marek knew her too well. She did not answer. She didn't need to. Marek exhaled once, the kind of controlled anger only truly loyal people are capable of. "This is how men like him get close." Serafina stood. "Then maybe he's already close enough for me to decide what to do with him myself." Marek stared for a long moment, then gave the smallest nod and left. But the damage was done. Because now the question was no longer whether the marriage was fake. The question was whether Serafina had just repeated the same mistake with a man who might be even more dangerous than the one who betrayed her. And worse than that, some part of her was already hoping the answer wouldn't make her send him away. That night, the city whispered louder than ever. Some said Serafina had lost her mind. Some said she had found a replacement too perfect to be random. Some said the new husband had the eyes of a man who had killed before. Some said Grant Mercer was drinking himself into a rage. Some said Veronica had started asking questions she should never have asked. Some said a rival family had taken an interest in the sudden appearance of a stranger inside Serafina's inner circle. And in the center of all of it, the man from the rain stood on the terrace alone, one hand resting on the stone railing, the city lights stretching out before him like he was looking at something he had once known intimately. Serafina stepped out behind him, file hidden in the folds of her coat, questions ready, anger ready, desire still inconveniently alive. He did not turn around when he spoke. "If you're holding a file on me," he said, "it means Marek found something." Serafina stopped cold. "How did you know?" He finally turned, calm as ever, eyes unreadable in the dark. "Because if he hadn't, you would have kissed me again before asking questions." She should have denied it. Instead, she reached into her coat, pulled out the file, and held it up between them. "Tell me who you are." He looked at the file, then at her, and for the first time since the rain, something in his face shifted. Not fear, not panic, recognition, old pain, old anger. The kind of look people get when the past finally catches up. He took one step toward her, then stopped. "If I tell you tonight," he said quietly, "you won't sleep at all." Serafina's voice hardened. "Try me." He looked out at the city again, then back at her, and the next words out of his mouth changed everything. "My name isn't Cole." That much she expected. What she didn't expect was the calm certainty that followed. And the men who buried my name would start a war if they knew where I was standing right now. Serafina's grip tightened on the file. Then maybe they're about to have a bad week. A faint smile touched his mouth, but it wasn't amusement. It was something darker, something like memory. You don't understand, he said. The day you picked me up in the rain, you didn't rescue a stranger. You dragged an old ghost back into a city that thought he was dead. Serafina's pulse kicked harder. Then stop talking in pieces and tell me everything. He stepped closer, close enough now that the distance between them felt electric, dangerous, unfinished. I will, he said. But once I do, you won't be able to pretend this marriage is fake anymore, because by the time Serafina hears his real name, the revenge marriage she created to punish one traitor is about to crack open a buried history of blood, power, and unfinished war. And the man she pulled from the gutter may turn out to be a fallen king with enemies far worse than Grant Mercer. King back from the dead. There are moments in a story where everything that came before suddenly rearranges itself into something sharper, clearer, and far more dangerous than anyone realized at the time. The night he said his name wasn't Cole was one of those moments. Serafina stood on the terrace with the file still in her hand, the wind cutting through the silence between them, and for the first time since she had pulled him from the street, she understood that whatever she had invited into her life was not temporary, it was not controlled, and it was not simple. He stepped closer, not with hesitation, but with the calm certainty of a man who had already decided the truth was no longer something he could keep hidden. My name is Rowan Hale, he said quietly, and that name alone was enough to change the air. Not because Serafina recognized it immediately, but because of the way he said it, like it carried weight, history, and consequences that had not yet reached her. Names matter in that world. They carry alliances, debts, bloodlines, unfinished wars. Serafina did not react right away, but her mind was already moving, already searching, already pulling at threads she hadn't realized were connected. That name was buried, she said slowly, remembering fragments from years ago, whispers about a family that had once controlled a network so tightly that even established powers had treated them with caution. Rowan gave a faint nod. It was supposed to be. He leaned against the stone railing, eyes on the city, as if it still belonged to him in ways no one else could see. Years ago, my family ran operations that didn't rely on noise or reputation. Quiet money, quiet movement, no unnecessary attention. That made us difficult to replace and even harder to track. But it also made us a problem for the kind of men who prefer power that can be seen and feared openly. Serafina stepped closer, her voice lower now, sharper. So they erased you. Rowan's jaw tightened slightly. They tried. The truth came in pieces, not because Rowan wanted to be dramatic, but because some stories are too heavy to be dropped all at once. His family had been dismantled from the inside, not by brute force, but by precision. Alliances turned, roots compromised, trusted men bought and broken. By the time violence arrived, the foundation was already gone. We didn't fall because we were weak, he said. We fell because someone patient decided we were worth dismantling properly. Serafina understood that kind of enemy immediately. Not impulsive, not loud, calculated, strategic, dangerous in the exact way she had built her own empire. Who? She asked. Rowan didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked at her like he was measuring how much she was ready to hear. The same kind of man who would use someone like Grant Mercer to reach you, he said finally. That sentence landed hard. Because now, the betrayal wasn't just personal. It was part of something larger, something designed. Serafina's grip on the file tightened. "You're saying my husband wasn't just greedy," she said. Rowan met her eyes. "Greedy, yes, but also useful." That changed everything. Grant had always seemed ambitious, but not strategic enough to orchestrate something complex. That had bothered Serafina from the beginning, even if she hadn't fully admitted it to herself. "And Veronica?" she asked. Rowan gave a short, humorless smile. "A door, nothing more." Serafina exhaled slowly, her anger shifting from personal betrayal into something colder and far more dangerous. "So someone wanted access to my empire," she said. "And they used him." Rowan nodded once. And while he thought he was rising, he was actually being positioned. Serafina's eyes darkened. "For what?" Rowan's answer was simple: to destabilize you before they moved in. Silence followed that, but it wasn't empty. It was the kind of silence that forms when two people realize they are no longer dealing with isolated damage. They are dealing with a plan. That was the moment Serafina stopped thinking about revenge as something personal and started thinking about it as something strategic again. "Who is it?" she asked, her voice steady now. Rowan didn't hesitate this time. "Victor Kane." The name landed heavier than the others. Serafina knew it. Not well, but enough. Kane was one of those men who rarely appeared directly, but whose influence could be traced through disrupted routes, silent takeovers, and deals that shifted entire networks without public conflict. "He doesn't make moves like this unless he's certain of the outcome," she said. Rowan's expression hardened. He thought he was. That distinction mattered. Because if Victor Kane believed Serafina was already compromised, then the next phase of his plan would already be in motion. And that meant time was no longer something they had in abundance. Serafina closed the file and looked at Rowan fully, not as a tool, not as a stranger, but as something else entirely. "Then we don't wait," she said. "We make the next move before he does." From that moment on, the marriage stopped being a performance. It became an alliance. Not declared, not spoken in dramatic vows, but understood in the way their movements aligned, their decisions sharpened, their instincts began to work in parallel. Merrick was brought into the conversation, reluctantly at first, but necessity overrides distrust when the scale of a threat becomes clear. He didn't like Rowan. That didn't change. But he understood what Rowan represented: information, experience, a connection to a past conflict that now overlapped with Serafina's present. "If Kane is moving," Marek said, pacing slowly, "then he's already placed people inside the outer layers of our network." Serafina nodded. "Which means we stop looking outward first," she said. "We clean inside," Rowan added quietly, "and we make him think his plan is still working." That was the key. Not resistance, not immediate retaliation, deception. The next few days were some of the most controlled chaos Serafina had ever orchestrated. Accounts were adjusted, but not enough to trigger suspicion. Routes were shifted, but not enough to signal alarm. Communications were tightened, but not cut. And through all of it, one thing remained consistent. The image of Serafina and her new husband continued to circulate: public appearances, private dinners, strategic meetings, every move reinforcing the narrative that she had recovered quickly, perhaps recklessly, from betrayal to outsiders. It looked like she had acted emotionally. To those paying closer attention, it looked like she was stabilizing faster than expected. To Victor Kane, if Rowan's instincts were correct, it looked like she was exactly where he wanted her. And that illusion gave them room to move. Meanwhile, Grant Mercer was unraveling faster than anyone had predicted. Grant's attempts to regain control had shifted from desperate to destructive. He pushed harder, leaned on the wrong people, made calls that should never have been made. That is what happens when men like him realize they are no longer part of the game. They start breaking rules they once relied on. Veronica watched it happen with growing unease. What she had once thought was ambition now looked like instability. And instability in that world is not something people survive for long. "You need to stop," she told him one night, her voice tight with fear she hadn't expected to feel. "You're drawing attention." Grant laughed bitterly. "Attention? I already lost everything. What else is there?" Veronica didn't answer, because she was starting to understand something too late. Grant had never been the architect of anything. He had only been a piece, and pieces, when they are no longer useful, are often removed without warning. That removal came faster than expected. It happened quietly. No dramatic confrontation, no warning. Grant disappeared for 12 hours. His phone went dark. His accounts froze. The contacts who had once responded immediately stopped answering. When he finally reappeared, he was different. Not physically broken, but shaken in a way that revealed something had shifted beneath the surface. He called Veronica from a number she didn't recognize, voice lower than she had ever heard it. "We need to leave," he said. She frowned. "Leave where?" There was a pause, and then he said the words that confirmed what Rowan had already warned. "They're done with me." Veronica felt the cold edge of reality settle in. "Who is they?" she asked. Grant hesitated, and in that hesitation was the truth. He had never known exactly who he was working for, only that the promises had been real enough to follow. And now those promises had turned into silence. That is when fear becomes clarity. Back at the estate, Rowan stood with Serafina in the war room, a space rarely used unless decisions with lasting consequences were being made. "He's been cut loose," Rowan said, referring to Grant. Serafina didn't look surprised. "Of course he has," she replied. "He's already served his purpose." Marek crossed his arms. "So what's the next move?" Rowan looked at Serafina before answering. That was new. That was different. That was something Marek noticed immediately. "We draw Kane out," Rowan said. "But we do it using something he doesn't expect." Serafina's eyes narrowed slightly. "Which is?" Rowan met her gaze. "Me." That answer should have been obvious. Instead, it landed with weight. Because it meant stepping out of the controlled structure they had built and into something far more direct. "You want to announce yourself?" Marek said, skeptical. Rowan shook his head slightly. "No, I want him to recognize me." That distinction mattered. The plan was simple in structure and dangerous in execution. Rowan would appear in a controlled environment where Kane's observers were known to operate, not openly, not dramatically, just enough. A face, a movement, a presence that would trigger recognition in the right person. That recognition would travel back to Kane, and if Rowan's understanding of his former enemy was accurate, it would force a response. Because men like Kane do not leave unfinished threats alive, especially not ones they believed were already gone. "He'll come for you," Serafina said. Rowan nodded. "He'll come for both of us," he corrected. She held his gaze for a moment, then gave a small, decisive nod. "Good," she said. "Let him." That was the difference between them and their enemies. They did not avoid confrontation when it was necessary. They shaped it. The meeting took place 2 nights later at a private club known only to a specific tier of people who understood exactly what it meant to be invited. Serafina arrived first, as she often did, establishing presence before anyone else could shift the atmosphere. When Rowan entered a few minutes later, the room changed in a way that confirmed everything they had suspected. It wasn't obvious, not to anyone without experience. But to the right eyes, the reaction was clear. A pause in conversation, a longer look than necessary, a subtle shift in posture, recognition, not complete, not confirmed, but enough. Rowan did not react. He moved through the room with the same controlled ease he had shown since the beginning, stopping at Serafina's side, his hand resting lightly against her back, as if that position had always been his. The message was clear, without being spoken. He belonged there, and anyone who thought otherwise would have to adjust. The response came faster than expected. By the time they returned to the estate, the first signal had already arrived. Not a threat, not a message, something more precise. One of Serafina's outer warehouses reported a breach, not a full attack, not destruction, just enough disruption to signal intent. "He's testing," Merrick said. Rowan nodded. "And confirming." Serafina stood at the center of the room, her expression calm, her mind already moving ahead. "Then we give him what he wants," she said. Merrick looked at her. "You're going to let him escalate?" Serafina's eyes hardened. "No," she said. "I'm going to let him think he is." That distinction was everything. Because the next phase was no longer about defense. It was about control. The confrontation, when it came, was not in a crowded room or a public setting. It was arranged in a place where noise would not travel and consequences would remain contained. An abandoned industrial complex on the edge of the city, long forgotten by anyone not looking for a place where things could happen without interruption. Serafina arrived with Rowan and a small, controlled team. Merrick was there, as expected. The air was still, heavy, the kind of quiet that precedes something irreversible. Victor Kane appeared exactly when Rowan said he would. Not early, not late. Coat. Precise. He walked into the space with the confidence of a man who believed he understood the situation. His eyes moved first to Serafina, then to Rowan, and in that second glance, something shifted. Recognition, not uncertainty, not confusion, recognition. "So," Kane said, his voice calm, almost conversational. "The ghost decided to come home." Rowan stepped forward slightly, placing himself just enough ahead of Serafina to signal something without needing to explain it. "You should have made sure I was dead," he replied. Kane's expression didn't change, but his attention sharpened. "We all make mistakes," he said. "The difference is how we correct them." Serafina spoke then, her voice cutting through the space with the authority that had built her empire. "You used my husband," she said. "You used his greed to reach me." Kane looked at her, and for the first time there was a hint of something like respect in his gaze. "I used an opportunity," he corrected. "The fact that he was yours simply made it easier." That was the moment Grant's role was fully understood. Not a partner, not a threat, a door. What followed was not a chaotic fight. It was controlled, sharp, fast. The kind of violence that happens when all sides understand exactly what they are doing. Rowan moved first, not with rage, but with precision. Every movement measured, every strike intentional. Kane was not unprepared. Men like him rarely are. But there is a difference between expecting a threat and facing someone who has survived the exact kind of dismantling you once orchestrated. The fight was not long. It did not need to be. Because the outcome had already been shaped by the choices leading up to it. When Kane finally went down, It was not dramatic. It was decisive. And in that moment, the balance that had been shifting beneath the surface for weeks finally settled. Not permanently. Nothing in that world is permanent. But enough. Grant Mercer never saw that final confrontation. His story ended differently. Not with a fight, not with a dramatic fall, but with consequence. Serafina did not kill him. That would have been too simple. Instead, she removed everything he thought he had gained. Accounts frozen, access denied, contacts gone. Reputation destroyed quietly through the same channels that once elevated him. By the time he understood what had happened, there was nothing left to hold on to. Veronica disappeared from his life not long after, choosing survival over loyalty in the way she always had. And Grant was left with something far worse than death: understanding. The understanding that he had not been clever. He had not been strategic. He had been used. And the woman he thought he had outplayed had replaced him so completely that his existence no longer mattered in any room that counted. Back at the estate, the atmosphere had changed again, not with chaos, with certainty. The threat had been addressed. The structure had held. The alliance had proven itself. And in the center of all of it stood Serafina and Rowan, no longer pretending this was temporary. The transformation that had begun in the rain had reached its conclusion. The man she had pulled from the street was no longer a stranger wearing a borrowed suit. He stood beside her as something equal, not in history, not in experience, but in presence, in power, in the way the room adjusted around him without being told to. Merrick watched it happen and, for the first time since the beginning, did not question it out loud. Because some things, once proven, do not require approval. They require acknowledgement. The final moment came quietly. Not in a crowded room. Not in a ceremony. On the balcony overlooking the city, where the story had turned more than once. Serafina stood beside Rowan, the lights stretching out below them, the same rain beginning again in the distance. "You never answered my question," she said, after a long silence. Rowan looked at her. "Which one?" She met his gaze. "Why? Whether this was ever just about revenge for you." He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stepped closer. Not enough to dominate, just enough to make the space between them feel chosen. "It started that way for you," he said, "not for me." She held his gaze. "Then what was it for you?" His answer came without hesitation. "The moment you stopped seeing me as something broken." That truth landed differently than anything else he had said, because it wasn't about power. It wasn't about strategy. It was about something simpler and far more dangerous. Serafina exhaled slowly, the weight of everything behind them settling into something quieter. "I picked you up to punish a man," she said. Rowan nodded slightly. "And now?" She looked at the city, then back at him. "Now, I don't know if I found something, or if something found me." He gave the faintest smile. "Does it matter?" She considered that, then shook her head once. "No," she said, "it doesn't." That was the final shift. Not dramatic, not loud, but complete. Because the difference between using someone and choosing them is not always obvious at the beginning. It becomes clear only after everything else has been stripped away. And that is how the story ends. Not with a beggar becoming a king overnight. Not with a queen saving a broken man. But with two people who should never have trusted each other, building something stronger than the plan that brought them together. She picked him up in the rain to destroy the man who betrayed her. But in the end, She didn't create a king. She uncovered one. And the most dangerous part of all is this. In a world built on power, betrayal, and control, the only thing more unpredictable than revenge is what happens when it turns into something real.